Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those joining us from any of the European time zones. This is the 12th session in our bi-monthly SG Declares and Shares series. We're now 2 years old in terms of these series. In the way of a brief introduction, Construction Declares, now known as Built Environment Declares, is an online petition uniting all strands of construction and the built environment. It started in May 2019 and now has over 9,200 signatories, significantly companies, in various disciplines and in 27 countries across the globe. The number of professionals engaged in the signatory companies is now over 1 million employees. In early January 2020, Singapore joined the movement with both Singapore architects and Singapore structural engineers declaring. In June 2020, we set up the Singapore and the Global Environmental Consultants Declare platform. This means that any environmental consultant across the globe who wish to join will be helped by us out of Singapore. About the same time, the Singapore landscape architects joined the declaration. We now have a total of 55 Singapore-based signatory companies, a number that is continuously growing. About today's event, today we have two new speakers, Professor Bhavna Sharma of University of Southern California and Prasoon Kumar of Billion Bricks in Singapore. They are going to talk to us about their work on embodied carbon and renewable energy. My dear friend Hui Min, who is one of the founding signatories of the Singapore chapter, has kindly accepted to moderate today's session. A very, very brief introduction to Hui Min. Hui Min is a director of DP Architects. She is passionate about innovation and advocacy of sustainable design practices, and currently leads the firm's efforts on sustainability and digital twin adoption. Over to you, Hui Min.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Hossein. I'm very, very glad to moderate this session, and I'm very happy to introduce our two panelists today. The first panelist is, sorry, I'm just calling up the information. Yeah, 1 second. Yeah, so Prasoon is from the Billion Bricks. I would like to invite him as well as Dr. Bhavna to give their views on the topic. And the topic today that we want to talk about is about embodied carbon. So I'm going to start with Prasoon first. So Prasoon is the co-founder and CEO of the Billion Bricks, is a President's Design Award winner, TEDx speaker, and social justice campaigner working towards eradicating homelessness. Prasoon began his career as an architect in the design firms across India, the United States, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Prasoon has received global recognition for his work, winner of Singularity University's Global Grand Challenge and named Urban Land Institute's 40 Under 40. He graduated summa cum laude from Arizona State University with a Master of Urban and Environmental Planning and an Outstanding Graduate Award in 2005. I would like to first invite Prasoon to give his take on the subject matter, and then after that I will invite Dr. Bhavna. So Prasoon, please.
All right, thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me here. Let me just share my screen. All right, so before we jump into the topic of really understanding about energy and embodied carbon, I think the question that I ask myself is, why is this something?
So you're muted.
Yeah, all right. So as we start into the topic of energy and embodied carbon, I think the first question that I had to ask myself is that, why is this a relevant subject, and why do we even care about this, or why do we want to listen about this? And this kind of made me reflect on how do we look at problems which are around us and therefore solutions around those problems as well. And it gave me a reflection on this example of, everyone knows this is the space shuttle, which the idea was to build a spacecraft that could go in and we could really bring space tourism to life for all of us. And in order for scientists to approach this, the idea was, how do you make traveling to space possible for everyone? Was to really say, okay, can we combine rocket and plane together? And there we've got a new kind of a spaceship that can do it. But in order to solve this problem, we ended up creating a new spaceship which had a lot more problems that had to be solved in an incremental way, such as it had these extremely large boosters that were required to push this plane up into the space, and that required fuel to be used, which was very difficult. And it became a big problem that had to be solved as we tried to build it. Similarly, when this had to come down this plane, the traditional shields didn't work, and therefore we had to put in all these tiles all over the aircraft, which not only made it look ugly, but also was something which really couldn't protect it for very long. And over a course of just a couple of decades, it not only never met its requirements of the initial goal of allowing for space travel, but also became the only vehicle which created the most number of loss in lives in our travel to space. The point I'm trying to make here is that when we try and solve problem in a way which is incremental and at times not aligned with what the solution needs to be, we end up creating newer and bigger problems that create this loop that we cannot solve. And one of the reasons why we are talking about energy and embodied carbon today is because we know that climate change is a reality that we are all facing, and building industry accounts for somewhere around 40% of these global carbon emissions. And the way we are building these solutions today is to take the conventional buildings and see how can we build in low energy systems in terms of operating them, in terms of the materials that go in, and therefore we have sustainable buildings for all of us. And we can see over the last 15 years, Singapore has built so many of these buildings around us. None of these existed when I moved to Singapore in 2006. And all of these buildings, in some way or the other, I think architects do pitch them as sustainable buildings, but we all know that how sustainable have they really pushed the envelope of Singapore as a country. In fact, this is a presentation when I was working in professional firms as an architect, and you can see my presentation had 80 slides, and the idea of sustainability was introduced at somewhere around slide number 76. And I don't think these things have changed, and the idea of sustainability is still towards the fag end of all the other visions and buildings, visions that we have when we are putting a building out there. And it's not that people are not pushing the envelope as well, right? When I moved to Singapore in 2006, Building Construction Authority had just completed this new net zero building, the first one in Singapore. And I remember going on multiple tours and taking other people around as well to say, now the future has arrived and we have figured out how to manage embodied energy and operational energy and build new buildings. And there you go, an example that we can now start replicating. 15 years since then, we are now in 2022. I think I probably know of only one other building, which is again at NUS, which is a net zero building, but nobody else has been able to embrace it or push the envelope. There are, I think, tiny pockets of some other examples that you can see, but certainly this didn't become a conventional way of architecture and building. And this has led to a point for us in our fight or in our quest to address climate change, that we are in a position where there's no point of return now. Even if we were to go beyond what our current policies are and pledges are, we still cannot meet the goals that we are required to save our planet. And despite all these conversations that we are having, these experiments we are doing, we are still not being able to do it. And therefore it becomes important that how do we take this idea and make it into actionable? And this is where my work generally is around, to say that instead of looking at incremental change, can we look at a solution which is completely new, but is designed for maximum impact for shortest amount of time and solve a customer's need? And I think the third point is very critical, because at the end of the day, when we talk about buildings which are efficient in terms of operations or embodied energy, does the customer or the user of the building or even the patron of the building, do they really care about it? if we go around shopping malls and stuff, we find that customers are more worried about the experience, about the air conditioning, the comfort, rather than what's going on in the background. And that influences our decisions as professionals as well, because at the end of the day, no one really cares about a lot of these things. So for us, what became important to say is that where is it that we can create this maximum impact if we were to do? So if you look at the total global building stock today, the majority of that stock sits in housing, about 74% of the world of that stock. And if you look at from within housing, where has the largest customer need? That's in the low income bracket where there's a very, very large shortfall. So for us, it was important to say that if we can build a solution which is sustainable, which is in housing and low income housing, and we can replicate and scale it significantly faster, then we may have a chance of reducing emissions substantially. And we look at housing as an opportunity where housing also creates a demand for energy, which means that housing is not independent, and just by making housing sustainable, we just can't solve the problems at a systemic level. And therefore, we have to address energy issues related to as well. And therefore, the idea for us was that if we can combine housing and energy production into a singular solution, we may be able to build buildings which have very low footprint in terms of the consumption. And I remember traveling through Philippines. The image that you see is how large affordable housing communities are built here. On the right, you see how solar farms are built. And we came up with this idea to say if we can combine housing with solar farms, then we could create something very interesting at many, many different levels. And this is really the vision that we are in to realize, which would be world's first net zero communities, which have housing and utility scale solar farm combined into a singular solution. To give you a sense of scale, the amount of energy that a community of about 1,000 homes would produce is about 10 megawatts, which would be about 20 to 25 times more than what this community itself would consume. But solution had to go beyond looking at just the energy aspect, and therefore we had to look at aspects of waste, water, food production, and really how does a conventional housing development operate, the image that you see on the left side. And by making the unit, which is our house, more integrated with additional services such as waste management, rainwater harvesting, food production within the community, we could really create a systemic solution which was far more leaner as opposed to very complex that we see today in our urbanized environment. And this is that unit, right? So the moment we break that down, large services and their efficiencies at unit level, where we look at natural ventilation, we look at energy production, we look at orientation, we look at structural safety and resilience in terms of disasters, food production, water, waste, sewage, and the overall experience for the homeowner, then we think there might be a solution which is highly scalable. From a material standpoint, we actually went in and categorized and really simplified the idea of building these houses, where we looked at prefabricated components where when we manufacture them, we can manufacture them not only fast, but reduce the wastage by about 20 to 25%. But by manufacturing them in bulk, we can also reduce the cost significantly. Then what is this next bucket of materials that we can get locally in the market, such as doors, windows, bricks, blocks, and we could use, and what percentage of that would constitute? And then there are certain off-the-shelf products, which I think is not feasible in today's world to get them from the local market. So you have to rely on all the supply chains that we have in order to be able to make a building functional. But this actually palette shows the entire, every building material that we use. And a lot of you being architects and engineers would realize that this is a very, very simplified version of what a typical house would typically need. We also looked at reduction in materials. So we looked at how we could actually use the solar panel itself as the roof, and we don't need to build an underlying roof. And we looked at our own prefabrication system, which can be worked at a local level that doesn't require use of cranes and very high energy equipment in order to assemble it as well. So the house is really a prefabricated system that can be very quickly assembled structurally and with solar panels. And then you can come in and infill the walls with other local materials and as you want to continue to build it. So this is here how it looks. This is one of the prototypes that we've done in India. In addition to this, we've also built a couple of them in the Philippines as well. But this was not all. We also had to look at the entire development cycle that takes a project all the way from sourcing the site to construction and operating it and making it efficient as well. The other reason for doing this was also that if we can't integrate technology in our work, it's very hard to scale it as well. So at every aspect of building design and execution, we have looked at how can we make that entire system efficient. And what this shows here is that in a typical housing process, and this is more related to affordable housing as opposed to some conventional high-end housing you would see, the construction typically starts after sales are done. And the reason is that because the homeowners are not often credit worthy, so the risk is very high if you start building it. And by prefabricating the houses, we can actually build them in a factory and assemble them as and when the payments from the homeowners come in, and therefore reducing the time of construction that needs to be done as well. We are also looking at site sourcing, generating master plans, financial models, totally in an automated way to speed up the process that it takes for a project from sourcing the site to actually executing it. So generally a pre-development cycle itself is 2 years. And while we may not see what energy we are using there, but it's all our time, travel, use of office equipment, paper that we use. And the idea is to streamline that entire process, enable it to happen. And then it goes on to a customer experience where the idea is how can we make this an attractive proposition from the customer standpoint, and they can really extract the value that we are trying to build. And the possibilities of this goes beyond affordable housing that we are exploring currently in the world. So as we speak right now, we are starting to build a large 1,300 home community in the Philippines that will generate about 13 megawatts of energy. So that's really like a power plant under which you are living and makes the entire community completely net zero. So I want to conclude by saying that we have no reason to fail because we can learn from the history, we can learn from our own environment. All we need to be is to be truthful to ourselves to say that what would it take for us to take this idea of sustainability and integrate in our work and not be driven only by our clients and customers, and ensuring that our own lifestyle embodies some of these things that we are learning today. So thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer questions post this, and we'll look forward to hearing my fellow panelist, Bhavna, now. Thank you.
Thank you, Prasoon, for a very, very inspiring presentation. And just a change in mindset of starting with sustainability and taking a very holistic view at trying to achieve your outcome makes a big difference instead. To have sustainability at the core, and congratulations on such impressive work. Let me now invite Dr. Bhavna to share her views on energy and embodied carbon. Dr. Bhavna Sharma focuses on low carbon materials for construction. Dr. Sharma's research spans micro to structural scale with a focus on design, engineering, and testing of non-conventional materials. Her research explores how to increase the resiliency of both natural and built environments. And she is an assistant professor at the University of Southern California. So, Bhavna, over to you.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction. So I will try to keep it brief. So I'm here to talk to you today about embodied carbon and how do we explore embodied carbon in the built environment. So we're already witnessing the impacts from the climate change globally. I'm based here in Los Angeles in the very early mornings in Southern California. And we're already seeing wildfires, extreme drought, extreme heat events occurring with more and more frequency. And so we know climate change is already here. And in addition to this, we're seeing existing natural hazards that we normally address in design for the built environment, such as earthquakes, also found here in Southern California, and risks that are inherent to increased urban densification, such as the lack of adequate shelter and affordable housing, which Prasoon just excellently covered in his presentation. So we know that we're going to have additional infrastructure needed, and we need to be designing today resilient infrastructure for 2030 and beyond. So we're really thinking 10 years ahead at this exact moment in time. And that is so that we can address the growing urban populations that are predicted to occur in cities globally. And this will not only require more urban land, but also more natural resources that are extracted to build this infrastructure. So if we look at the carbon footprint of a single building, we can trace it from the initiation of extraction of resources all the way to its demolition and end of life phase. And so emissions occur at various stages within this design process, from the manufacturing, materials, construction, operation, and use, as well as demolition. It's an odd place to start, but I'd like to start our conversation at the end of life. And this is to disrupt our design thinking and the way in which we approach design. So if I were to ask you to design a building to be disassembled and taken apart and reused, would that be something that you would find easy to do? I'm guessing that you're going to say no. It's a very challenging thought process and thought exercise to think about how do we actually disassemble a building where we can maintain the initial primary use and reuse it in a new structure. So our previous methodology of approaching end of life in the built environment has been to recycle or reuse materials to avoid landfilling these materials. So that could be using concrete as infill in roadways. So ideally, we would want to have a building that has a long lifespan, and we would want to reduce the need for replacement so that we didn't ever have to deconstruct or disassemble or demolish the building. But if our buildings are needing to be disassembled, we can design for that. And this would avoid additional processing and downgrading of materials and allow us to use materials for longer. So how do we do that in the design process? Well, first of all, we can increase the lifespan of our building components. So designing it for a particular lifespan, ideally something that is in multiple years, so that if the building does transition from owner to owner, we can pass on that lifespan in terms of a warranty. Also design it for disassembly and reuse. Think about the way in which we connect all of the building components so that we can actually disassemble them easily and then transport them to a new site where they can be reused. And then understanding our products that we're specifying and what the end of life pathways are. So not all materials will be able to be disassembled and reused, but if we understand what the emissions are associated with their end of life pathway, we can account for that in terms of looking about the embodied carbon in our particular building. So moving on, the next phase that you would consider typically is the operational carbon or operational emissions phase. So again, just a reminder, I'm going backwards in terms of our building construction. So this is the use phase of our building, and this is exactly what Prasoon talked about in his presentation. So thinking about how our building actually consumes energy, and in his case, is able to generate electricity as well. So we're already doing this, and this has been a big area of push in terms of the built environment as we make buildings more and more efficient, and that is to reduce our operational carbon and our emissions associated from this use phase. As more and more cities shift towards renewable electricity grids, so here in Los Angeles, we are planning to have 100% renewable electricity grid by 2050. So the emissions for the operational phase of a building will diminish. So that's not as simple as saying, I will just have renewable energy, and then that way all of my electricity will be green, so I no longer have emissions. It requires shifting operations to electricity, which also looks at reducing natural gas. And so you need to do advanced planning in the design or retrofit stages of your project to account for these changes in MEP. So how can we account for some of these design features in terms of continuing to reduce our operational emissions? So that's looking at things like energy modeling for optimization of daylighting and passive solar, as well as passive ventilation, which I noticed in Prasoon's diagram of the structure that had that incorporated. That was really great. Also knowing your energy mix of your current city and what are the future plans for 100% renewable electricity grid, so that you can ensure that the building is able to adapt to these changing conditions. And then also eliminate or provide pathways to adapt and remove non-renewable fuels. So here in California, we have some buildings that are currently using natural gas for heating and cooling. And so we're looking at ways in which to adapt the actual MEP to ensure that we can switch over to our 100% electricity grid and then be able to turn off that natural gas reliance. So what most people think about when someone says embodied carbon or embodied carbon in construction is just the materials that go into the building. So this is really looking at the manufacturing related emissions and the emissions related to transporting the materials to site, as well as constructing the actual building. And so while that is correct, we look at primarily the embodied carbon or the emissions associated with manufacturing material. The whole life cycle is actually what we want to explore to get a full picture of what the impacts are from our building design. So when we're looking at embodied carbon in terms of manufacturing emissions, we assess essentially every single stage of the manufacturing process and look at the ways in which the emissions are contributing to overall global greenhouse gases. And so these emissions are calculated based on the industry or supplier, and also can include third-party certifications, which I'll talk about in a second. So again, how do we address this in practice? So there's lots of embodied carbon tools out there. There's one here in the US called EC3. There's the iStructE calculator out of the UK, and many, many more, which I won't name now. And if we adopt these early on in the design process and use them for iteration in terms of our different design solutions, that allows us to explore the different options that we have and what the impacts are from our different design decisions. And how do we do that? We want to collect life cycle data or environmental product declarations, which give us an industry standard of the emissions associated with particular building products. Now, it's important to consider where you are regionally, because some of these are very specific to a particular location. So I've had a project where we looked at embodied carbon of wood. And we looked at solutions both here in the US as well as a project in India, and had to account for the difference in terms of supply chain of where the material was being sourced. And then also thinking about manufacture for assembly and disassembly, working with your manufacturer to be able to design products that can be assembled and disassembled and also can be repaired to ensure that long lifespan. So if we account for all of these aspects and put these ideas into practice, we'll be able to not only reduce our embodied carbon from the built environment, but we'll also be able to assess what our current embodied carbon is throughout our building's life cycle. And just to finish off, just combining this diagram of the building's sort of lifespan along with the RIBA plan of work, and just looking at different stages where we can understand that. So while the RIBA plan of work here is shown very linearly, we know that it isn't a linear process, that it can be iterative. And that's very much true for looking at embodied carbon in construction. So ideally, we would advocate to a client to reuse an existing building, and this would eliminate the need for additional embodied carbon emissions from a new construction. That's not always the case for a variety of reasons. And so when we do have to design a new structure, we want to design for a long lifespan as well as design for disassembly where possible. And then thinking about the different aspects, we want to look at optimization. So that's not only spatial optimization, but looking also at structural optimization as well as optimization of our MEP. We want to look at modeling in terms of embodied carbon as well as energy modeling to again optimize the reduction in that operational use phase. And we also want to look at ways in which we can design for disassembly. One of the most important things that I've found in my work is the procurement phase. Being able to cost out innovative solutions seems like a current barrier to adopting new ways in which to design. So really working with procurement early in the design process will help to understand how this might impact your final bid and costing. And then finally, thinking about not only the building and the emissions associated with the building, but thinking about the neighborhood that surrounds your site and thinking about your city and how you can contribute to improving the overall environment. Again, thinking about the interrelationship between the natural and built environments. And then finally, when we think about embodied carbon, we don't want to just end it at the use phase where we hand over the building and we no longer need to think about it. We want to do post-occupancy evaluation. We want to continue to model where possible. And also we want to document and create a database for disassembly. So a future owner and a future designer will have the information necessary to carry through with the original aspirations of designing for disassembly. And that's my very brief overview of embodied carbon in construction.
Thank you, Dr. Bhavna. What a really interesting presentation to follow Prasoon's. Part of his Building Bricks project was about designing for assembly, and Dr. Bhavna is also now extending that to designing for disassembly. A very, very interesting follow-up indeed. Now, I've taken from both presentations, both speakers' presentations, that a holistic viewpoint towards and a circular approach towards the design, construction, and operation of the building is necessary if we were to tackle the sticky problem of carbon, whether it's embodied or operational carbon. And it seems like there are ways to do it, there are tools out there to do it, and there is know-how to implement them. But at the same time, like Prasoon was saying, there are not so many good examples of how these buildings can show up in the current state of things. So I wanted to pick your brains, both of you, a little bit on why that is. What are some of the challenges of going towards this kind of a holistic approach, delivering on both operational and embodied carbon savings? This circular approach towards the the cycle of building development, so to speak. Maybe I'll start with Dr. Bhavna first.
Sure, thank you for the question. For me, it's that the embodied carbon really represents your supply chain, which means that it represents your scope 3 emissions, which are one of the hardest things to track. You're reliant, if you don't have primary access to the data, you're reliant on your suppliers providing you with that information. And so I think the challenge there is being able to collect the information as well as being able to have a certain level of certainty, so reduce our uncertainty in our predictions of what these emissions are. And so I think that's one of the barriers. So using things like environmental product declarations provide a third-party certification. They provide ability to compare industry standards or industry averages. And so you're able to get a sort of broader perspective and incorporate the uncertainty into your analysis. And so I think that methodology is very powerful. It's not perfect. I think there are also limitations to that approach. But I do think that being able to have that validation of the data that you're utilizing to make your assessment is very helpful, especially with practitioners. Environmental product declarations are something that you can obtain from suppliers that you know.
It seems like the approach to enable more people to adopt this circular approach is the availability of validated and accurate data. It's like a reliability of source that needs to be obtained. May I invite Prasoon to take your view on the challenges, why not more people are tackling this circular approach to design, construction, and operation?
Yeah. So I think there are two reasons why I think this is not happening. The first is that today we are in this pursuit of, I think the first reason is really the education, right? So I remember when I studied in architecture school, we knew that how to orient the building, passive design principles, which is part of it. And we have over the years kind of unlearned those things. So when I teach in architecture here in Singapore, that's something I have to teach and it's not obvious anymore, right? So I think at the education level itself, it takes us an effort to do the right thing now because it's just not obvious. There aren't enough examples around us. And then we have this approach, which is around looking for data to validate that this is something which needs to change and what impact it's making as well, which requires more education to be provided, very high level of caliber, very high level of complex networks and systems to calculate what is circularity, what does it take to implement it. And it's just, we don't have enough manpower, expertise to do it at scale. And hence we keep doing it wrong again and again. So I think one reason is education. The second is that we have today disconnected our values from what we need to do. So we know inherently what is right. We know that putting glass in a tropical climate is the wrong thing to do, but we still do it because we just think that it's probably okay to do it. The client wants it, the customer wants it, the building looks right. And then we want a data to validate that, okay, what was the embodied energy in it? What is the operational energy, and how through other systems I've been able to actually negate it and put in an air conditioning system, which is more efficient as well, even though we know the first step we took itself was the wrong step we took. And so therefore, I think it's a disconnect between the education that we are getting and the lack of supply of the talent to be able to do this work at scale. And second is we've just keep our values aside from our work on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you for that very insightful answer. So I draw some commonalities in some common points from both of you, and they center on lack of resources, lack of data, lack of expertise to a certain extent, and it's something that it means that we have to solve this problem together. And it's a community-based solution, because if one person is to assemble all that data, one person to have all the knowledge to look at the holistic view, it will be very challenging indeed for us to achieve these goals. And perhaps the working towards a shared goal, a more holistic, integrated approach is the way forward. I wanted to tap on your personal experiences, because both of you have a passion towards the sustainability, especially the circular approach. And for Prasoon, you have turned it into a business value add. You know, and I wanted to kind of also hear from you why you decided to do it. What pushed you to do it? I mean, the challenges we've identified aside, was it in a way in response to these challenges? Yeah.
Shall I go first?
Yeah, yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the reason I did it is for the fact that in the architecture and urban planning community, which is where I belong, we talk a lot about sustainability. We talk a lot about what's the right thing to do. How should we build cities which are about equality, buildings which are about sustainability, thinking in long terms. But our actions are not what we speak. We only speak them in forums like this, but we go back. And I mean, when I was an architect, I would go back and design fancy skyscrapers all the time, right? If my client would come in and say, I want marble from Italy, and Prasoon, you fly down there, I'll be so excited, right? I won't think about the carbon footprint. I'll go down there, select the marble and bring it, and never try and convince my client that the carbon footprint is too high. And for me, it became a personal drive to say that, is it even possible to walk the talk, or should we just stop talking, right? Because if it's not possible, then we should probably not do it, right? So I took upon founding Billion Bricks as a personal challenge to say, can I build an enterprise, and can I actually survive financially and be able to actually run such an organization and build products and solutions that keep this thing in mind, right? And the fact that I've lost all this hair means that it's very challenging, and it's something which is not scalable, what we are trying to develop. So it's very, very hard.
It's a very commendable effort, and I can imagine the amount of passion behind this. I'm going to pose the same question to you, Dr. Bhavna. So why are you interested in researching innovative materials, and what drove you to pursue this passion for sustainability?
It's a winding road in terms of my pathway. And I think it really stems from understanding that we have a responsibility, and that's not only to current and future generations, as is the sustainable development definition, but it's also to nature, and to ensure that our impact that we leave behind is not so severe that nothing is able to survive. And so that really is what drives me in terms of my research as well as my teaching, is just being able to share my own sort of perspective and knowledge in the field, and hopefully inspire others to even make small changes in your design approach, to be able to think about design in a different way, where you think both about the natural as well as the built environment. And making these connections, making these small changes as a collective, then we're able to make a monumental change, and that will help to not only decarbonize, but also for society to adapt to the current climate change impacts that we're already seeing, and to do our best to mitigate those impacts from our most vulnerable populations, which is what Prasoon mentioned in his presentation as well.
Thank you, Dr. Bhavna. So it seems like in a way, for both of you, you wanted to demonstrate to yourselves and also to raise the awareness that having more people understand the sticky problem, and so that we can work together towards the sustainable goal. And in the same spirit of raising awareness, I wanted to raise a few questions from the audience, so that we could share your expertise with them. One of the questions that came for Dr. Bhavna, this is related to renewable energy of buildings. So in terms of using renewable electricity to power buildings, do we consider the emissions from the manufacturing of the technology itself? That means, do you consider the embodied carbon of solar panels? That, because these solar panels may not be sustainably manufactured. Yeah.
Right, and that's completely a wonderful question to ask. And I love that you're asking it, because you're already thinking about your supply chain for your structure. And so it depends on where you draw the boundaries for your analysis. So ideally, if we were talking about a single structure, so a lot of hospitals here in Los Angeles are utilizing solar panels on top of parking garages as a way in which to generate electricity as well as reduce impacts. So if I were to be talking about that specific project, then yes, I would want to incorporate the manufacturer associated emissions in my assessment. And so there won't necessarily be zero emissions, but what we're aiming to is we're aiming to reduce those significant emissions from the built environment. And so by shifting to, say, renewable electricity, such as solar panels, versus using natural gas or some other energy source that's non-renewable, we can mitigate those emissions that were originally there and replace it with not a perfectly zero emissions product, but electricity that's generated, which will be reduced there.
Thank you. So it does sound like there's quite a deep, it depends on how deep you want to go. I mean, if you have, I mean, at least start with low-hanging fruit, and if you want to go deeper, you could go into the sources of the renewables as well. There's a question for Prasoon on a wider approach towards like the impact of sustainability on the wider market. What are your thoughts on how, if any, sustainable design of housing can have an effect on the real estate markets in general?
So I believe the question is probably referring to like real estate in general and the financial implications of it. So I think there are two aspects to it. One is that there is a cost associated with making buildings more sustainable. The market for real estate, especially in housing, is primarily driven by the land cost, right? So the land is more expensive, your house is more expensive, and whether the house is built sustainably or not sustainably has no implication on the eventual price of the house. It's per square feet cost of the house is really based on the location and what the market can demand. In fact, I was at a launch which happened in Singapore last week, where apparently I think 75% of the houses were sold over just a matter of days. And I just to poke this question to the real estate agent, I asked, what are the sustainable design features in this particular condominium? And the response I got was the real estate agent was completely zapped and said, sustainability what? So the point is that we in our world think everyone cares about sustainability, but out there when you're selling houses, the agent doesn't know, the customers who are buying, they don't care. And therefore, I think the impact of sustainability on real estate market would probably be minimal, if any. But we as responsible professionals, and what Bhavna mentioned as to personal drive, we know what's the right thing, and we have to drive the process in the correct way forward.
Right. I think for residential units that are being sold, that there's no there might not be such a direct impact from the financing, but there is a huge move towards green financing now. So anybody who is in the market to get money to develop real estate will be subject to very stringent sustainability outcomes or goals that tax to the buildings. And some, I mean, so in related to that, there's a question again for both of you. Would companies be open to finance housing in rural areas and poor areas? And I mean, I guess this question means is that the outcome is not so, you know, it's not the same as a real estate development that is conventionally for profit in that way. So how would something like that work? I mean, in the Billion Bricks project, it seemed that the sustainable, the holistic approach to sustainability was a way to make the housing more affordable. And do you think that improved the so-called the business viability of affordable housing, let's say in the rural areas and the you know, more remote areas? What do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
So I'll probably give an honest answer on this, right? So the idea of sustainability and linking it to business model is something which is for Billion Bricks are totally two independent things. The innovation that we've actually done is in the financial modeling of the way we are building communities, and it has nothing to do with sustainability. What sustainability does is that today, a lot of people want to hear it and it opens doors for us. But when it comes to actually financing the project, it's pure based on returns. In fact, just going back on your green financing, I mean, we can't access any green finance as well on our projects. So it's a pure ROI based project. The return on investments are purely commercial. There's no discount for them being in the rural area. The only innovation that we've done is that we are combining the housing financial model with a solar farm energy model. And we are able to bring in certain efficiencies that allow for that housing to become more affordable. And one clear example of it is when we combine the two, the land that we are utilizing is the same. And therefore, we are using same land for two things. And therefore, there's some efficiency that we can then transfer to the investors and to the homeowners. And to give you a sense of reference, when I first started developing this concept, the idea was to make the housing cheaper and more affordable by about 50 to 100%. And as we are now in the process of implementing, the affordability of the housing is reduced to about 15 to 18%. And that's because at the end of the day, the financial investors keep extracting more and more financial value out of the project and away from the community.
So in other words, you combine two sustainability needs into an innovative financing model to really make the ROI work, right? So that I think it's quite an innovative approach. So in that light, so Dr. Bhavna, do you have any insights on how some of these, because you were talking about procurement, right? So one of the challenges that you highlighted was in the procurement of materials. How people could not really get their head around the cost, and hence I infer the so-called financial model and the viability of using projects that will deliver on low embodied carbon outcome. So can you share a little bit on maybe some thinking towards how that could be overcome in the same light, like, okay, combining sustainability outcomes? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's really about that community approach that you mentioned earlier at the beginning of our discussion, that the number of stakeholders that are involved in the design process has just exploded. And that's completely necessary to achieve the goals that we're aiming for. And so that would involve, you know, if we're looking at, say, a comparison of two structural systems, one out of say steel and concrete and one out of mass timber. And we're looking at the actual structural systems and if it's adequate for our project. So we might actually have the opportunity to say, okay, well, we could possibly do the mass timber solution based on our loads, and we're going to move forward with that. And if you move forward with that without bringing it into the conversation in terms of costing and talking to the procurement staff in your practice, then you may find out later down when you've locked in the design process that it's not possible, or you may find out at that point that you don't have the suppliers that can provide you the materials that you need in terms of regulations or in terms of price point for your client. And so being able to involve various stakeholders, and that's not only talking about procurement, that's talking about potential contractors who might be involved in your project. So really looking at this from like a design build perspective, and being able to have these conversations collectively and collaboratively will reduce issues that you have further along in the design process, which we all know, but it also help you to optimize and create that efficiency, which is essential in addition to thinking about the emissions regarding materials.
So I wanted to kind of bring this to link these two together. So on the one hand, there are challenges to try to, there are a huge number of people you need to coordinate the supply chain to really understand the embodied carbon that your project would entail. And it seems to me that if we started with a design already and then try to measure the embodied carbon, that would be much more challenging than if you went on an approach. Let's say I have a certain approach to reduce embodied carbon right from the get-go, like how the affordable housing case study was. You've already had in mind, okay, I just wanted to use these type of materials. It's going to be designed for assembly or designed for disassembly, and you already pick things that have a certain chance of making a low embodied carbon, rather than design it from, without thinking of it. That approach might be a little bit more successful, easier to achieve the outcomes, whether it's carbon reduction by operational or embodied carbon. How do we get more people to do this approach? I mean, there's financing, there's we saw the example of creativity, we saw examples of working together, but just saying that we have to work together, it doesn't seem to it's still a very challenging thing for us to do. I mean, if you had one thing you would change in the journey you've taken, in the challenges and experiences that you have encountered, if there was one thing you could change in the way things are designed, procured, operated, the processes that you have encountered, the lack of education, lack of awareness, what would you propose that people do to change this?
I was waiting for Bhavna to unmute herself first, so I could have some more time to think on this one.
I mean, because it seems to be a very big question, but it seems that we've come to a very sticky problem. We have all the means and methods. Means and methods are there. The researchers have spent decades to sort this out. We know where the challenges are, and we know that what it takes is passion. I mean, people like yourselves, driven by passion to drive the sustainability outcomes, and the willingness to admit that, putting sustainability at the core has to also be accompanied by, hey, practicalities, ROI. It's stuff that have to keep it viable. So how do we move everyone towards working more together? I mean, we identified you need to build a database. Is it the government's role? Is it the community's role? How do we get this forward? And then how do we encourage more examples like holistic thinking towards building products like the Billion Bricks project? I mean, maybe I can rephrase it that way. How do we unlock this? When we say we need to work together, how do we work together? Who should be working together, right?
Yeah, so I think that there are two things I would say. I think I want to address one of the points you mentioned about, like, how do we really make this happen, right? I think the biggest opportunity that lies in implementation of any of this is the government policy. If something happens at a policy level, then whether the customer wants it or not, the financier wants it or not, things just get aligned. And the governments have to remember what a government's role is. And government is not a commercial enterprise. And more governments today are also looking at themselves as commercial enterprises and trying to say, how can we be profitable as governments, and the social good is taking the backseat. So I think if they go back to what the root of a government need is, I think that would really work well. So, I mean, Singapore is a great example why 85% of the people have access to housing and own housing is because the government's hand is there involved, and then it's not totally left to the private markets. Right? So I think government can really play a very, very important role. The second point about the complexity of managing all these people and stuff, I think the real magic wand here is that we have to move away from building more complex systems and saying that we need to measure everything, we need data, we just have to do the right thing. We have to maybe introduce value-based learning in our schools. We need to learn how to implement it in our professions, and we have to stop talking and doing more and more. And instead of doing more for others, we just have to go home and look at our own houses and see how much electricity we are consuming. Did we get the marble from Italy for our house, or did we not get it? And just do the right thing for ourselves, and I think the world will change.
In other words, we need to walk the talk and to also hold governments to their responsibility in driving this forward. How about you, Dr. Bhavna?
I would agree that policy is a key component to this, and it's already happening in various parts of the world. And so I anticipate that will increase in terms of providing the pathways to adopting these types of methodologies. In terms of how to increase adoption in terms of practice, the way in which I think about it is get comfortable with being uncomfortable. So we've become very comfortable in the way in which we do things, the way in which we design and build and construct the materials we specify. And if we start to disrupt our own thinking, our own design process, that will unlock innovation after innovation after innovation, just as Prasoon's project has demonstrated. And so thinking about problems in different ways, turning them upside down, that will already start to provide some benefits in terms of that. So I know that's not answering your question about how do we collaborate together, but I think on an individual level, that's how we start to rethink our own design process. And that in turn will help us create conversations and collaborations that will start to build those networks, build those bridges that will help us to scale this up.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhavna. So
Hui Min,
yes, I hear, I know,
yeah.
2 minutes. Yes, Hossein, you wanted to say something.
Just once you're done, just give me 30 seconds to wrap up the.
Okay, I will. So I wanted to bring this to the host. Actually, I wanted to build, because if you need a community and you're doing such difficult things and you have to be very disciplined about it, you are walking the talk not just for yourself, but from because you have peers. And I wanted to share how important it is to be part of a community. Such as Built Environment declares, because that's exactly what it does. It's a community of peers. I would say a community of the converted who have the passion to do this. And it's stuff like that, discussions, forums, to help remind people of each other's responsibility. So with that, I wanted to thank you, and I wanted to hand the speaking back to Hossein to close.
Thank you, Hui Min, Bhavna, and Prasoon for the very insightful and engaging hour with us. As far as the Built Environment Declares is concerned, we continue to talk. It is good to talk, and we continue to convert some of the talking that we do into walking, because we need both of them. Of course, and I really appreciate your contribution. Thank you, Bhavna, for being up so late at night to be with us, and Prasoon, you from your busy schedule, and Hui Min, I know how busy you are as well, and I appreciate your walking the talk and coming here to talk to us about the things that you're doing. Our next, this session is going to be on our YouTube channel, the recordings. We have a lot of questions that unfortunately the time has not allowed us to cover. Some of the, as many of these as we can, we will provide answers for through the speakers and put in the comment section of the YouTube channel when it is uploaded within the next few days. Thank you very much again. And our next session is in July, right? In 2 months' time. And I look forward to seeing you and our audience there. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having us here. Great session. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.